Hey, this is CJ with CompRCC.com, and in this series of videos I'm going to be assembling the new Team Associated B5m team kit. And now it's time to assemble the transmission. First I need to slide a couple bearings. And there. Those just slide right on into place. Since this is a mid-engine car, there are two idler gears. The extra gear changes the rotation, so the motor is now in the front instead of in the back, so there's a change of rotation going on there. That extra idler gear handles that. There's a little bushing that slides over the shaft here. Slide that into place. Put the little axles for the idler gears in. Now you don't want to put a lot of grease into this transmission. Usually just put a few wads on the primary gear of the differential and let that spool up through all the different gears. And that will continue to spool around in there as those gears rotate. You don't want to put in too much, but you don't want there to not be enough. And there we go. The bolts go in from the opposite side of the shaft that the motor is going to drive. The slipper clutch is going to go on here. When you tighten these down, don't tighten them too hard. Over tightening these, it may sound surprising, but you can collapse this transmission enough that you will bind up the gears. That will make the transmission not work. So I'm just going to start them all a bit, and then I'll go around in a star-like pattern, tightening them all up. There's a lot of places you can use a power driver. This is not one of them. You could potentially use a power driver to disassemble. You can use a power driver to disassemble any part of a car without probably causing any damage. And that's what you want. You want the transmission to spin nice and smooth. One last thing in case I didn't mention it, when you're putting the ball diff into the transmission, you want the side with the thrust bearing where you will make your adjustments, you want that on the opposite side from the top shaft. This is where your spur gear and slipper clutch assembly is going to go, and it's just easier to get to and adjust from this side. Now the transmission's together, it's time to assemble the slipper clutch. Make sure that you've washed your hands thoroughly, because during the process of putting the diff together and building the transmission, you're going to get a lot of grease and diff lube on your hands, and you don't want any of that getting on the slipper clutch plates. This is the order that the parts go in. You want this piece to be flat in here. It's got to fit in. Same thing with this piece, has to fit right into that. So if it's got a little bit of a bend to it, as this one does, go ahead and set that in here, and then slide that on so that it catches and stays in place. Okay, now that I've got that in place there, I'm going to lower that and make sure that that is seated. I can drop in my pads. You kind of have to push them in a bit. That metal washer, the slipper plate that goes in between those two pads. There we go. So assemble like so, and then hold this by its sides. Keep a finger on here, lower that down, and rotate it until it locks in place. Okay, so everything is now seated. Put on this spring. There's a little cap with an edge, and that drops down into the spring, keeps the spring centered. And then you can start tightening that bolt down. And you want the shaft to be flush with the top of the nut as an initial setting. Like so. This will get adjusted later in the process. First, you're going to want to break in the diff. Once the diff is broken in, then you can set the slipper clutch. Now the transmission goes in. Make sure that this part is lined up properly here. Now there's two more bolts that go in through the top of the transmission, and those go into the rear shock tower, and that, along with the two bolts from below, reinforces the shock tower. So as you can see, everything is very modular. The transmission can be removed easily. This lower suspension mount that adjusts your kick, that can be unscrewed and that can be slid out and replaced potentially without having to remove the transmission. Might be a little tight, but the transmission itself is all of 4 and 2 and 2, 8 screws, and the transmission is off. With a powered screwdriver, this goes very quickly on the disassembly. So now our transmission is assembled and mounted. There's not too much left to do.